Hello, everyone. I wanted to invite you to join the Creative Social Impact Collective. It is a community of creative-minded change makers like you that are working together to deepen their impact in the work they're doing. And as a thank you, you get a free download of the 5 steps to reimagining or imagining a new program, project, venture, or movement to bring the change that we want to see into the world today. Hope to see you there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Artists in Action. I'm your host, LC Walter, and today we have wonderful guests. I have my producer, Kimberlee Nicole Smith, and our esteemed special guest, Dr. Myles Moody.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here with us. I greatly appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get this thing cracking. That's what I always say. So you were here because one of the best things that I heard recently, because I was ear hustling over a webinar, was your presentation about racism and public health. Could you expound on that for a little, for the folks who are listening to this right now?
Yeah, sure. So I would say a few weeks ago, for in observance of Dr. King's, holiday and birthday, I was invited by the Department of African American Studies at the University of Florida to come speak about racism and public health and affordable health care, and pretty much through the lens of his timeless book, Where Do We Go From Here? And little known fact, Dr. King was a sociologist. Myself, I'm a sociologist too. So there were parts of the book that I just found myself really, kind of gravitating towards. So for instance, he talks at length about some of the structural changes that need to happen outside of just legislation, right? He was talking about how even after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all this wonderful legislation, the March on Washington, there were still problems, in Black communities. And it was largely due to poverty, neglected communities, schools that were underperforming and still pretty much segregated. So essentially he was seeing and also dilapidated housing, right? The conditions that Black folks were living in primarily and working in. And he was seeing that just because folks had kind of moved the pen, there were still some major issues that needed to be addressed. And he was kind of turning his focus towards attacking, or I shouldn't say attacking, but criticizing capitalism, because essentially what it does for us as Black folks is we don't always benefit from it the same way. And fast forward to now, pretty much what we see now in Black communities, primarily Black communities, is lower socioeconomic position, schools that are underperforming, pretty much everything I just said. And that was over half a century ago, if my math is correct. What year is it, right?
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness, I think that anyone who's interested in trying to learn more about the plight of Black folks, particularly economically, that's a great book to start off with. Where Do We Go From Here by Dr. King. And I was essentially speaking to some of that while also weaving in some of my own research on racism-related stress and how that is a unique, that's a stress burden that is unique to racial and ethnic minorities, right? White folks don't experience
Nah, I don't
racism.
know if they know about that when they wake up in the morning, but it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing.
Right.
It's
We
funny
all
that
do
you
have
speak to that
stress.
though. I think one of the cool parts about what I heard you say then, and you just echoed it again, was this is inextricably connected to capitalism. So it's like in Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racism. Like those are twins, like they're joined at the hip. The thing that you get from one, you unfortunately, it's a byproduct of the other. And the fact that it's deeply rooted and connected to the haves and the have-nots on that racial lens is huge. And I think a lot of people don't realize that Dr. King was trying to attack it. He was more radical than a lot of people like hold him up to be, because he was like, nah, this is, you sign this document into law, but who's really going to put it into effect? Like, and I think unfortunately so many of these policymakers that we have, will they'll go back and they'll talk about this legislative bill and HB this and, Senate bill that, we got it, but who's enforcing it? And I think that's a big thing, that we still don't have the feet on the ground. We don't have the movement behind it. So I'm happy that you spoke to that. And that was one of the parts I was like, oh, he's really talking about this. I love this. I love this.
Yeah, a little bit. And I think that, many of the problems that we had back then, we're still experiencing today. That's how deep some of that stuff runs. So got a lot of work to do.
Myles, the thing that popped at me, because I was watching and paying attention, and people were ear hustling. um, what popped at me, it was super new. And I think we use a lot of words, and I don't think people really understand. So I'm gonna call it out. Racism. A lot of people use the word racism, and there were some things that you talked about. We've heard of, and you mentioned today about structural racism. We've heard about systemic racism, but there were some others that you talked about and gave some really cool examples about, like, this is what it looks like when this is happening. Can you share a little bit about the different types and maybe give some examples so our audience can wrap their brains around what we're talking about?
Sure. And I'm really glad that you asked that, because racism is one of those mechanisms that's really, really complex. And sometimes, because we grew up in society, we just kind of take for granted certain terms, but we don't actually fully know what they mean. And you hit the nail on the head. Structural racism, systemic racism, it gets thrown around so much today in the media. People don't really define it. And I think that's unfortunate, but the way I like to define it, at least for my students in Intro to Sociology last semester, was I wanted them to think of racism as a complex system that, of course, uses this ranking system of, race and, white supremacy, of course, and then the other, to kind of allocate specific resources and goods, right? So one example, if we want to take it back, because, the origins of racism, they run pretty deep in this country. We can go back to, let's say, the Jim Crow era, when folks were trying to get decent housing, but they were unable to move into certain neighborhoods, because of redlining, and perhaps they weren't able to get homeowners insurance or, loans from the bank, right? So that, and based on their skin color, right? So that is one example. And folks will call that probably institutional racism if we're going to talk about the types, right? But I always wanted my students to know that it doesn't just stop there as far as explaining what racism is, because you also have, obviously, discrimination on an interpersonal level. And if you can understand discrimination, which essentially means unfair treatment, right, based on someone's social status, then you can understand how institutions and people who work in those institutions can discriminate interpersonally and through the institution. So now we have two different types of racism. And then I think one of the most important forms of racism is cultural racism, because that really undergirds both of those types of racism. Essentially, those are the beliefs, right? The prejudice, the attitudes that pretty much spurred and started, what we have now. It all started with these ideas that certain groups are inferior because of their skin color and their culture. So I think that those three together are really, really important: cultural racism, institutional racism, through hiring practices and things of that nature, but then also interpersonal racism. And I think interpersonal racism is the one that gets talked about the most. But in order for us to think about this in a structural way, we have to include all forms of racism. Now, there are other forms, gendered racism. That's kind of an example of how you as a Black woman, you're going to have different types of racism thrown at you because you're a Black woman. Whereas me as a Black man, I'm seen, a little differently. They're going to throw racism at me in a certain way. Of course, environmental racism, but I think the three main types that people should focus on is interpersonal, institutional, and cultural racism, and that'll help you understand structural racism as a whole.
I think that the structural piece to it and how because the construct is what we're looking at, right? And if you go back to the incept of redlining and how that really when people talk about the division of the country, the dividing of things, right? Redlining was huge because here we are, Reconstruction era. Well, people starting to do things and people starting to migrate from space to space, and they're like, well, since we're free by the letter of the law, I can go and be and this and that and the third. But someone's like, well, we want that land too. So wait a minute, we already did the divide and conquer thing. There's no more manifest destiny because we are here. That's what they said. But then you are only subjugated to live there. And then what ends up happening, all of the policies that are written to actually bring funding and all this stuff off into one direction is not actually being, proportionally reasoned out and rationed out. So the fact that you have that layer is so much superficial to a lot of people. And it's like, the other side of the tracks mentality, they think it's superficial, but it actually, like you said, it is being held up by all the other different things, because what's on top of that is because you live there. Now I can look at you and judge you and have this interpersonal feeling about you because you live over in that space. And then I'll look at, oh, and that's the skin color that goes along with it. So that's a huge thing, what you just said right there.
Yeah, and I think that, just to kind of build on that, that point is so important. I mean, even just people simply not wanting to be in the same spaces as Black folks, right? You mentioned Reconstruction. I mean, you just freed all these enslaved people. And, for centuries, white folks didn't have to dwell with us, particularly in the South. But now all of a sudden, y'all want them to move into our neighborhoods, and this lasted for decades. I mean, we know about white flight, and how inner cities became what they became. I mean, even something as simple as Black folks trying to get in the same swimming pool,
Right.
as white people. That's really at the core, of racism, which is why I think cultural racism is so important. Again, like your belief system, if you believe that this particular group is, inferior to you and disgusting and dangerous, et cetera, that's going to drive how you treat them,
Right.
and subsequently how they're viewed by society as a whole. So.
That's great that you put that way.
Oh, all right. We just gonna call it out.
Please.
You're Black. Myles, I see you.
Yeah.
And you're a sociologist,
Yeah.
right? Sociologist. I said it right? Because I'm good for messing stuff up. I want to know, other than the fact that you Black and you're a sociologist, what made you decide you wanted to research racism? That's not the only thing sociologists take a look at, but what made you say, this is what I want to do my work in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always just bring it back to the social determinants of health. They're so big, and racism is a social determinant of health. What I mean by social determinant of health is you have, actually, I'll just say it this way. So around the time of like 1899, when Du Bois was, he was the first Black PhD from Harvard and all this stuff. He was going to do this really, really great study on Black folks in Philadelphia. Now, this is around the time when science is kind of, advancing a little bit. But what he noticed was that the health disparities between Black folks and white folks in Philadelphia weren't really rooted in biological stuff. It was rooted in their social conditions, right? Where they lived, where they worked. and how awful those conditions were, right? The types of jobs that they had to have, that would exhaust them, and then essentially the wages that they had that wouldn't really allow them to get the resources that they needed to be healthy and well, over the life course. Those are social determinants of health, and racism is a big social determinant of health. Again, going back to my first definition about how they use that ranking system, to decide who gets what, basically, right? And now it's a lot more, covert or subtle, right? But there are still ways in which we're perhaps denied certain resources that could be beneficial to us, even just our communities, right? The schools, the housing that people have. I mean, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but these really are the most fundamental things as far as allowing someone to have, opportunity to be as healthy as they can be every single day.
Which is funny because when you think about the antithesis of that, because what ends up happening is what they will put into a community versus what we need in a community, right? So one of the people who we've studied before in Louisville had a program, one poem at a time. So instead of seeing a liquor store billboard or a liquor company or a cigarette billboard, they put poems up. They put things up that actually showed the positivity in the community versus, hey, I got this big corporation. We got liquor stores on the corner. We know for a fact we want to put that out there. And here again, we're talking about capitalism at its finest, saying, hey, we want to, people subscribe to that and this and that and the third, but you're more apt to put that in the Black community, because if you actually go to a white community, I'm sorry, I've never seen Cool Filter Kings billboards in the suburbs.
Yeah.
I've never seen a Newport dude or Joe Camel back. You remember the Joe Camel back in the day sitting on the back of a car? Oh, so, but that's a real thing. So, and it, like you said, it's so subtle that people look at it and be like, oh, just another billboard. It's cool colors and this and then the third. Who are they marketing to in that community to be like, yo, this is an escape to do something else? But it's so pervasive because you said political determinants of health. That's a social determinant of health as well. So that's
Absolutely.
that they're so stuck together, and I think uh, lending the ear to that is what people don't pay attention to, and I think that's something to actually lean a little bit more toward. It's regardless, like you said, it's regardless of socioeconomic standing, because if you had people in Philly at the time who had income that were doing what they had to do, but what was the quality of life that they had based on that?
Yeah.
That was so I love that you brought that up, Elsie, that one poem at a time, right? So what blew a lot of people away when we introduced that was that it was an artist and an arts organization that did that and that brought that out. And it was based on, for our audience that may not know about this, Hannah Drake is a phenomenal poet, an activist and blogger, and she says she does her work to make people uncomfortable. So if you follow her on social, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And she has no qualms about it. But she went to Africa and recognized for the first time in her life she was somewhere that it reflected who she was, and it made her think about where she actually grew up, and it did not. And so she took that experience and took it back to the place that she grew up in and said, hey, what does these images say about you? And I think about Myles and his work about the stressors associated with, racism, but also the arts and marketing and communications, right, is a reflection of what's in the world and how do we absorb this and what does it do to us? You to speak you that's in your research. So tell what did your findings come up what came up in your findings that you think people need to know about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I always make this little joke. I don't even know if it's funny, but I always say it. I mean, I'm not in the line of science, where I have these wonderful, discoveries that nobody's ever thought of. For me, it's more so like, hey, y'all, racism is bad, and, Black folks are like, yeah, we know. We've always known, right? So for me, it's more so about trying to break down the intricacies, and hopefully lay out some findings that might be target areas for intervention. Because, I don't want to be, well, I should say we, as researchers in this area, because there's a few of us, we don't want to be the type to just lay out the bad, right? Eventually we want to say, now this is what we can do to change this. One thing that I found, of course, that is in the bad side of things, is that racism and racism related stress, it's so pervasive. So some folks like to use the term from crib to coffin, and that's actually a manuscript that just came out for anyone who's interested. I believe the first author's last name is Jones, but you'll just have to look it up. It's a group of Black psychologists, and they're making recommendations for how to intervene and address racism-related stress. But the main premise is that it is, and I actually argue that it's from the womb to the tomb, so to speak, right? Because the stress that we experience, that begins even before you're born, right? If your mother is experiencing a bunch of stress and is patterned by racism, and that type of adversity, that's going to affect you. And we know that Black babies are more likely to be born with lower birth weight, and of course the mortality rate, we know those very heart-wrenching findings that we see sometimes, or that we hear about, particularly with Black women and childbirth. So that's all a part of it. It starts then, and it goes all the way throughout our entire life, right? So, and not only that, but we're not just impacted by stuff that we experience personally, but the experiences of those with whom we're closely tied to, right? So if you have a partner, a child, a best friend, an associate, coworker, and they experience racism and you hear about it or you see it, it's going to trigger you as well. And if it's stressful for them and y'all are close, you're gonna have to take on some of that stress, because that's just how relationships and social ties work, et cetera, et cetera. So, the main thing is that it's pervasive, is from life to death, essentially. But then also we can't really escape it, even when we're not experiencing it ourselves, it's still going to be around us. And even when nobody in our bubble is experiencing it, we're going to have to watch it on TV or Twitter, social media, et cetera, because we've got a lot more viral content now. Now, I believe we've always had viral content, and that didn't start with Rodney King, that didn't start with even Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. I believe it began even with lynchings, et cetera, right? Because I was sending a message, to everyone. But that's how long it's been going on, right? And that's how long racism has been acting and impacting folks in very, very complex ways. So that's kind of what my research does. I try to disentangle some of that. And I try to focus on things that will help build resilience, for Black Americans. We're extremely resilient. That's also something that we found. But oftentimes resilience, it can sound good, and it can appear good on the surface, but there are going to be some hidden costs, to our health and well-being in other ways, right? So while we might have better mental health, in some cases, we might have worse physical health because the stress, however we cope with it, because we have our own mechanisms, may not be the healthiest way, or it's still breaking us down on the inside, right? So that's where some of those findings come from on mortality, life expectancy, higher prevalence of diabetes, obesity, hypertension, et cetera, right? So that's kind of where my work comes in, because as I said earlier, we all have stress no matter what group you're from, but racial and ethnic minorities have this added burden of racism related stress that white folks don't have, right? And folks who do the research that I do, we believe that that is a huge component, to what we're seeing.
When you said, I'm gonna go back a hot second, you said that we have that resiliency, and it's not rooted in truth be told, it's not rooted in a whole lot of empirical science. What they did was, back in the day, and I think you can speak to this as well. So back in the day, they were saying, well, you can subject Black folks to so many different things because they can handle it, like and all these horrible studies they thought were, well,
And
they're
we
Black, they
believe
can
it
handle
too.
it. And not only did people believe it, this was so-called vetted in so many medical journals, like the thing that you go to. It's like, doc, so you mean to tell me that a Black woman is supposed to be able to experience all of that pain? No. That thought of this fallacy of the high threshold of tolerance for all this, that, and the third, for Black men and Black women, it was, well, kind of sort of, we kind of knew that, as being enslaved people, that, yo, you got to take it when they give it to you, not necessarily because you wanted to, but it was, I couldn't let somebody else see me like this, and I can't let this white person in front of me who's subjecting me to this know that they breaking me, but on the inside, we're defeated, we're this and that and the third. And it takes me back to a quote. I love my quotes. It's never the load that breaks you down, it's how you carry it. Wilma Rudolph, right? So we carried it for so long, and after a while, it's like I think Kim used to tell me this all the time, the Chinese torture, when you just keep dropping the water on somebody over and over and over again, until all of a sudden it's just like something that shouldn't be that big just becomes this big thing to you. It's those things that we talk about, um, that affect us, and it turns into a generational thing that never should have been a generational thing in the first place. It's, if we were really doing the thing that we said we were going to do, to promote the common defense, to support, the welfare of all, like things that the country's founding documents actually say, and those tenets that we want to actually be like factual, not fallacy. And I think that when we go down that lens and we think about what your research is speaking to, I think about the way that so many people who've experienced these different things, how they can help us with outlets to this, especially in a creative way. Because primarily, just reading things, people not going to pick up and read it. People not going to want to, like, oh, they got this new study that says XYZ. Like, so when you think about the research and everything that you have, like, how would you help somebody understand that, yo, you can break away from that quote unquote generational thing, by understanding where it comes from? Like, how do you see that being an impact? And Kim, you can speak to this as well, because you deal with that community as well, the artistic community as well. Like, what are different ways that people can actually make it so it is accessible, like the research that you have?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll go first and then I'll let you take it away because I think that's more your area of expertise. But um, one thing that I've been thinking about, since we first talked is how there are some ways that, are more common um, as far as like disseminating information. So I think about, for example, um, Ava DuVernay, right? And what she did with the Netflix documentary 13th and many of her other projects as well. Um, it's informative, but it's produced and put out in a way that people are able to digest it. For those who maybe aren't trying to look at dry words on a piece of paper, right? They can look at images and see stories, right, being played out on camera. And I think that's always been highly effective, for people in this country. But moving beyond that, I think that it's going to take some partnering, kind of like what we're doing now, to brainstorm on how to, I guess, package some of those findings and that information for individuals, because I don't blame them for not wanting to read. I mean, academia, you know, they make us write our research in a very mechanical method, and I get it. It's because, you know, scientific rigor and all that stuff, it's important for that. But for the everyday person, and I would like to include myself in that bunch as well, because I'm not always trying to read that stuff. You know, I think that it's important to
Appreciate the honesty. Appreciate the honesty.
I'm gonna always keep it honest. That's not something that I always look forward to. It's not the most poetic or colorful writing, just to be honest with you. But I do think that there are other ways and other methods that we haven't tapped into yet, for getting some of that information out. But I think my main example that I've always seen in my life is through film. Yeah.
Well, dang, you don't even need me to say anything, Miles. You done already hit it. So as I think about all the things that you shared and the question that Elsie asked, I also think about my friend Stacy Springs is a researcher, and I'm gonna say the wrong place. I know she's out of Brown and Howard, not Howard, Harvard. Sorry, Stacy, don't kill me. But
You can say HBCUs. Don't worry about that. We love it. Shout out
oh,
to the
okay.
HBCUs.
Shout out. Yes. But one thing that she brought up as a researcher that works to do research in arts is that there's something different when, as a researcher, you can deliver the data and the findings of your research with a little color, with a little music, with a different presentation. They don't really want to hear it. It's kind of boring and dry too. Like when you in a big conference room, when we was doing that, and you listening to colleague after colleague, you know, speak about their stuff. Or I will say this, as an entrepreneur, when you are in love with your work and you're talking to investors that you want to buy into what it is that you're selling, or as a practitioner, you want, you know, participants to be participating in your program. If they bored with it, they really not listening to what you have to say, and they're not in love with it the way that you can. But the arts has an amazing way to make things relatable. It tells a different story. It evokes emotion. It allows people to have empathy for what it is that you're talking about. Um, and I think even going back to the example with one poem at a time, I think it was pretty entrepreneurial that allowed what you said. Racism, we already knew it's here. We already know it's a problem, right? The creative mind of that artist went somewhere else to do her work and saw something and recognized, huh, this is something different. Sometimes you have to go somewhere else to see a change. And I find it's the creative mind that allows um, for innovation to come forth. Like, who would have thought that people could actually contact the billboard company and say, hey, we noticed this. We need your help to make a change. What? It takes an audacious person. And I think for me, the most audacious people I know are creatives that happen to also be artists. So there was one poem at a time, but along with one poem at a time, they were making policy change with real things, with the people that benefit from capitalism, and saying, hey, we noticed this. Hey, we think this is a problem. Oh, and we noticed that y'all are telling people that there's a meeting to vote on a thing, but people don't know that there's a vote going on. We need to change that. You know what I mean? She didn't paint a picture for that. She didn't write a poem for that, but she saw something. And that's, I think, when we think about arts and culture and what it can do in this space, it also takes innovation and creativity and some audacity to kind of lead the way. And that use viral buzz, right? Because somebody heard she was doing it, told somebody else, and the community backed it. And they were walking down the street with their poems, changing the climate of where they lived. And now the whole city was affected by one community's stance against what they were seeing. So It's not my conversation. I sure took it over. Thank you.
This is probably the most important part of it, you know, and I appreciate you sharing that. Kind of makes me want to think about, you know, ways I can sprinkle in, you know, ideas such as that, you know, in my future classes, because I think that's probably where it's going to have to start. And innovation is probably one of the coolest things about what you just said, because again, we're not always trained to be innovators on this side. So I think that, but we still need innovation, you know, of course. So I think that um, those who specialize in that, you know, and those who do the type of work that I do, we should come together more often, you know, like Transformers or something, you know.
For
Uh,
sure, for
like,
sure. And that's
mm,
what this is all about too, is it's about calling on cross-sector collaboration, because the being an and I'm new to this, right? So you don't like you said, you were not asked to be innovative when we're coming up in school, right? Being what I learned of being an entrepreneur isn't really about starting a business at all. It's about being a creative problem solver. And I think the most creative problem solvers I ever met were mamas. Somebody mom done figured something out, you know what I'm saying? Where it was like, well, I don't know what we're going to do. Right. And we just talked about not Black folks not having, Black and brown people not having, but you got to figure out how you're going to make it happen.
yeah. My mother was excellent at that. She still is. Just want to
Right.
Shout out to the urban engineers. We call those people urban engineers because they have
Hey,
to reverse engineer everything.
absolutely.
And to make a direct connection to both of what you guys are saying, because though one person is leaning from the creative problem solving person and the other person is leaning from the actual researcher, I'm the person who wants to galvanize these two things together and bring out the action. So you are the action part of this. We have the art, we have the artist, and now we have the action. And the action piece that I would lean upon both of these groups to do a wonderful cross collaboration is um, go into those classrooms that you're speaking of and you're teaching, and talk to them about those policies and things that actually really mean something. And then ask specifically, how would you want to send this message out to the masses other than just the APA, you know, 6th edition version? You know, with that, and then I would go back to the entrepreneurial people and say, we have this thing, and we know that this is what's important. What communities is this impacting? And I think because we look at, you know, this from a racist lens, it goes back to something that you said earlier, and I wanted to speak on this, and then I'll take us on out of here with this one. People get the wrong perception when we talk about white supremacy, as in somebody who's walking around with black boots and some kind of, you know, axe to grind and this and that and the third. But that's not it's a depiction of what people have with a white supremacist thought process. But when we think about the term supremacy, that is the most prevailing thing. So if the white is the prevailing thing, and I think this is where people misinterpret when we talk about racism and white supremacy, they think of people in sheets going down the street as supremacists. No, 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 no. The supremacists are the people who are in shirts and ties, and they're in executive boards, and they're legislators and these other people who they do help write these policies that can positively enact things that happen in the Black and brown communities, but they don't put forth the effort that the entrepreneurs say, hey, this is how we're going to solve this problem because this connects to that research. So when we look at that lens of supremacy, and I think that's the one thing that people kind of gloss over a little bit. We say white supremacy, but we don't really talk about in just what supremacy is. That means that's the prevailing thing. And if it doesn't go along with the cultural piece of how it's actually enacted, that means they want to still assimilate people to that particular lens, but we cannot, under any circumstance, remove the power that Black culture brought to this country, that brings to communities like ours, that brings joy and other things to other people. Not to gloss over anything from an Americanized point of view. However, the soul of folk is ingrained in us, And because we understand that there's a lens of culture that needs to be addressed, supremacy is not a negativity, it's just a positive way of saying this is what's happening when you look at it from that lens as opposed to everyone's lens. And I'm gonna close it out with that right there. Mr. Moody, Dr. Moody, I don't want to say Mr. Dr. Moody, Miss Kim, thank you guys. Any last words for either one of you all, especially Dr. Moody? What do you have coming up for us now?
Well, I know that I'm going to be focusing on a reflection, for for Medium and thinking about some of the things that we talked about today. Other than that, just focusing on building body of work as far as research, hoping that that will allow me to connect with folks like you all a little bit more and have more to offer. But for me right now, I'm so early, in this stage. I just graduated last year. So right now I'm just trying to build and continue to strengthen, what I already have and maybe some of those weak spots tighten up a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've got going on as of right now. And thanks again for having me. I also wanted to say that.
Oh, no doubt. You are officially one of the dopest people we know. And we absolutely were blown away by listening to your presentation at that webinar. We're like, hey, we got to talk to him and our audience needs to hear from him. So thank you so much for taking the time to just lean into this and taking a look at what the role of, arts and culture can do in spaces that you work in. And so we look forward to that reflection piece on our Medium publication. Thank you so much.